Let's talk about binding. So I like to use 2 1/4 inch wide straight of grain strips. What does that mean? That means they're 2 1/4 inches wide and they're cut with the fabric. So I need to join these strips. And what you're going to want to do to join your strips is to place 2 ends of the strip, right sides together, at a 45-degree angle to each other. Now, if you want maximum accuracy, here's what I recommend. Draw a line corner to corner. So my line is going from this overlap down to this overlap. So I'm going to draw a line. Now, this line is, and I know you probably can't see it. I don't have to draw it super dark, but this line is going to be my sewing line. I'm going to sew from here to here with roughly a 2.2, 2.4, 10 to 12 stitches per inch. I'm going to sew directly on that drawn line. This is going to join my 2 strips at a 45-degree angle, and we'll look at that again in just a moment. So I've sewn on the line that I drew. Now I need to trim away this excess. So I'm going to trim away, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then the next thing I'm going to do is take it over to the iron, and I'm going to press this seam open to distribute that seam bulk. Okay, so I've pressed the seam open. I've pressed it flat, and this is from the right side of the fabric. You can see it's virtually invisible. This is what it looks like from the wrong side. There's my seam. Next, I'm going back to the ironing board because I'm going to fold this in half like this, wrong sides together, and I'm going to create my narrower binding strip. All right, so now I have all of my lovely binding. It is pressed in half. Now it's batik, so I get you can't really tell, but it is pressed wrong sides together. So I have a folded edge and I have a raw edge. And the raw edge is what we're going to be sewing onto the project. So let's look at how to prep our project to get ready to attach the binding. All right, so let's talk prepping our project for attaching the binding. Now, I'm going to really encourage you to quilt your project first before you attach the binding. This way, as you're quilting, you will have pushed everything out to the edges. And then I like to trim my project. So I'm using a small project so you can see the whole thing. I like to trim my project down before I attach the binding. And I'm going to recommend that you use a square as well as a long ruler, okay? Because we want to get this project as square as possible. So you can do one of 2 things. I like to start with my square corners. So I could take my long ruler and trim up the edge, but I really want to make sure that I have nice square edges. So I want to check that, and I want to see, can I make that happen? Can I get a good square? And this is where you could use a fabric marking tool, and you could mark it if you wanted to before you trim, because just like everything else, a little bit of patience and perseverance is going to go a long way. All right, so it looks like I am pretty good with this. So I'm going to trim up this edge. I'm going to get a nice straight edge. I want to stay, I've got this star point that comes all the way up to the 1/4 inch, and I want to preserve that star point. So when I trim, I'm going to trim based on that star point. Now this is no different than when you're piecing. If you have a little bit of variance in your seam allowance out here on the edge, what happens in the seam allowance stays in the seam allowance, right? So nobody has to know. So I'm going to trim using that star point as my base. And I'm going to trim this away. All right, and then I'm going to rotate around. I'm going to do the same thing again. Now, when I trim, here's what I want to do. I want to do the same thing as though I were rotary cutting. I'm going to use that straight edge as my guide and the edge that I just cut. And I'm going to place that edge on a line on my ruler. Okay, and then I've got more star points that are coming out to the edge. So I'm going to pay attention to those to make sure that I don't lose that point. Okay, I'm going to get everything nice and smooth underneath my ruler. I did press this project after I quilted it before coming over here to trim it. Okay, and before I go any further, let's check that corner to make sure we haven't wiggled any. Is it nice and square? And so far, so good. Yay. All right, so I'm going to rotate again. We are just working our way around the project. And again, excuse me, I am cutting using that straight edge that I created and my star point to make sure that I have a nice straight edge. And you can see, yes, I'm working this a little bit underneath here to make sure that I have everything pulled nice and smooth. Okay. All right, let's check that corner. We should be good. We are indeed. Let's go to the last edge. All right, and again, a line on the ruler on that raw edge that I cut. I'm checking those star points because I want to preserve them. Poor planning on my part. I mean, this was a project of my own design, and I should have given myself more wiggle room here with the star points and let them float a little bit, but I didn't, so we're working with what we've got. Okay. All right, so I've got straight edge on here. And trim. All right, now, before I get ready to attach my binding, I'm going to go back. I've checked the other corners. These are the last two that I've cut. So this is nice and straight. So I'm going to slide this over, and is this good? And it is, because a square project is going to be a lot easier to attach the binding. Now, when we're ready to attach the binding, I'm going to be honest with you. I keep stuff pretty simple. So I'm going to take my binding that I prepared, and I'm going to take that open edge, and it is going to line up along the raw edge of the quilt. I machine sew to the front of the quilt, and then I'm going to give you two finishing options. You can machine sew on the back, and I'll show you what that looks like, or you can hand stitch, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, when I start to attach this, you can see that I have lined up the open edge with the raw edge of the quilt, and this is what I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. This folded edge is going to get wrapped around to the back. Now, I am not going to start sewing right here at the edge. I'm going to leave myself a little tail, and that's going to give me some room to tuck this in, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, let's talk about turning the corner. So you've sewn your first stitch, you're sewing all the way, and I sewed all the way to the edge, and I stopped. Now, I'm going to pull up, and yes, I can kind of pop that stitch or pull that last stitch out. That is no big deal. And actually, I do want to give myself a little bit of leeway. Now, here's what you're looking for. I've got, see that lovely 45-degree line? It's going from the edge over to the edge of to the top corner of the quilt. So I folded up. Now I'm going to fold down back towards myself. So here are some tips as you're doing this. Two things you want to look for. You want to make sure that this raw edge right here lines up with this raw edge that's right there underneath, okay, the fold. The other thing is you want to make sure that the fold up here, so you folded it away from yourself, you flipped it up and then folded it back down, is just a smidge above the raw edge of the quilt. This gives folding room for you to wrap everything around. All right, so good news is you get 4 chances per quilt to practice your corners. Okay, so let's talk about those corners. You folded your corner and you folded it away from you, you folded it towards you, you go back over to the sewing machine. Yep, you just start sewing right there. So you are going to be stitching across your other stitches. Now, when it comes time to finish this, to join these ends, let's talk about that. You may remember I had you leave a tail. So here's what I like to do. Now, this may not be how you've seen binding done before, and if you want to join yours another way, feel free, but this is what I do. I cut off the selvage edge. I am going to finger fold this so that I have no raw edges showing. So I am finger folding this down into the inside. So there's my raw edges are now folded inside so that I have a nice finished fold on the outside. Okay, then you're going to notice I stopped sewing before I got to that. I'm going to take this piece, and here's where my stitching started. This is where I started sewing my binding, and remember my tail was loose. So I'm going to take this binding where it overlaps, and I'm going to cut not at a 45-degree angle. It's actually a pretty steep angle. There's no perfect angle. There's no must do or have to. The one thing you do want to do is make sure that your angle misses that stitch. And I actually need to trim a little bit more off so I've got some wiggle room. All right, and then this is stinking easy. So I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to tuck it up inside the piece that I started with, that fold. Okay, and you can see I'm using my scissors to just kind of get that piece in there nice and smooth. All right, and see everything just lines up nice and easy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine. I'm going to start sewing back here a few stitches behind where I stopped. So I'm going to start sewing here, and I'm going to sew all the way across this fold, and I'm going to sew past where I started so that my stitches overlap and they're going to secure. And then we're going to talk about how we want to finish this. Okay, so we've tucked our edge in, we've sewn across, and we've joined it, and it is virtually invisible. So you think, okay, now I'm ready to start stowing. Almost. I'm going to turn this over because what I need for you to do at this point is to come into the corners and cut away the quilt right there at a 45-degree angle. We're just reducing some of that bulk that's going to be here at the corner. So you're going to do that on all 4 corners, and then we're going to be ready to turn our binding. Okay, let's talk prepping this for finishing. Now, I've gone ahead and pressed my binding out. If you haven't made best friends with your iron, there is no time like the present. I find that pressing the binding, once I've sewn it, pressing it out is going to help it lay nice and flat. So we need to rotate our binding over to the back side. Now you've trimmed your corners, so let me show you one thing that I have found works wonderfully with my corners. I'm going to be folding this binding down, and I want a nice crisp corner when I fold it. So one of the things I have discovered is that I tend to get a better corner if I fold opposite the front. So what do I mean by that? All right, I'm trying to hold this up. So when you look at this binding, do you see how this part of the binding, the fold, is on top of this? All right, so I have found that most of the time, like 99% of the time, if whatever was on top on the front is on bottom on the back, I get a lovely sharp point. Look at that. Look at that crisp corner. That is a thing of beauty. I know, it's the little things that make us happy. So I prep all of my corners. And one of the things I like to do is as I'm folding, I like to go ahead and use these binding clips. And they're going to hold everything in place. So I can fold all the way around. And I like my binding. This is a personal preference thing, so you choose. But I should have pulled some binding clips out. Pretty noisy, huh? Sorry, folks. I like to press and then fold this down. And I like to put these binding clips all the way around, because what I have found is, especially when I'm hand stitching my binding, is that this is going to kind of press this sucker in place and really get that binding in place. Now, when I fold it over, my personal preference is for the binding to be filled up by the quilt. I'm not trying to match the edge of my binding with the stitching line. So my binding on the back is actually a little wider than my binding on the front. All right, now we talked about finishing edges, and I'm going to show you hand stitching, but I also want to show you another finishing option. And I really like this one because it's super fast, and that means I get to move on to my next quilt. All right, so let's move this one out of the way for just a second. So here is another small project that I finished, and I machine stitched the binding to the front. I folded it over just like I told you, but then I used a coordinating thread color, okay? And I used a thread color that blends with my background on the front of my quilt, and I machine stitched it down. So on the back, let me hold this up a little bit closer for you. Can you see I stitched maybe 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fold? And I did this stitching from this side. So when I had this in the machine, I am stitching along here. So this thread, this is my bobbin thread. This is my top thread. And I stitched all the way along the edge to secure that binding. Now, if you choose to do this, I'm going to recommend that you lengthen your stitch length. And here's why. You're going through a lot of thicknesses. You have 2 thicknesses of fabric with your binding. You have your backing, you have your batting, and you have your quilt top. That's going to suck up a lot of your stitch length. So if you choose to finish it by machine, great, kudos to you, but lengthen that stitch length. Maybe go up to a 3.0. You can experiment and see what works best for you, but if you don't, your stitches are going to be uber tiny, and that may not be the look that you want. All right, so that's the machine stitching option. Okay, let's talk about hand stitching this to the back, if that's the option that you want to take. Now, I'm going to sew with black thread, not that you would, but I want you to be able to see my stitches. And I'm going to be using what's called a ladder stitch. It may be called other things as well, but I've heard it called a ladder stitch. And I'm using, if you look at this in comparison, this is a fairly small needle. I'm going to recommend using as small and fine a needle as you can tolerate, because the finer the needle, the easier it's going to be to make your stitches. And I also find that if you use a shorter needle, you're going to get shorter stitches, which is going to give a nicer look. All right, so with my ladder stitch, I'm going to start in the backing of the quilt. And I'm going through the backing and the batting, but not the front. And I'm going to fold the binding back down. I want you to see my needle is just a little bit under the edge of the binding. Okay, and I have a knot, but I'm not worried about it because it's going to be covered by the binding. All right, so there's I'm in the backing fabric. I'm going to come up directly across from where I came up in the backing, and my needle went in. So if you can see that, do you see how my needle went into the binding right there directly across from the backing? So it's coming directly up, and then can you see my needle? Do you see I've got a little bit in? I just slid it along the fold edge of the binding, okay? And then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm in the binding, okay? There's my thread. I want to go down into the backing and batting, but not the quilt front. And I want to make another small stitch. And you'll notice that my stitches are right there just underneath the folded edge of the binding, because I want to keep these invisible. Okay, and I'm leaving these loose right now so you can see them, but we're going to tighten them up in just a minute. And then I'm coming up and I'm going into the binding and sliding along the fold. So I'm just inside that binding, just sliding along the fold. Okay, and then I'm doing the same thing again. Move this clip out of my way. But see, already my fabric is starting to behave. It's staying right there where I had put the binding clip, and it's not moving. Okay, and I'm coming back in. All right. So there are my stitches. And you see how it kind of looks like a little ladder? But I can pull these tight. And look, even though I'm sewing with black thread, once I pull them tight, you can't see them at all. And I'm keeping a fairly small stitch. It's not super, super tiny, but it's not really big either. I don't have great big gaps. But I can do that all the way around the perimeter of the quilt to sew that binding in place. Now, some folks like to, every 6 or 8 stitches, stop and do a stay stitch. So a stay stitch would be, I'm coming out, I'm going down here into my backing. But before I come back up, I'm just going to make a tiny little loop, tiny little stitch. And what that's going to do is that's going to keep that loose stitch, because you saw how I just pulled that ladder tight. It's going to keep that from coming undone. But if you're going to do the stay stitch every few stitches, make sure you have the tension like you want it on the stitches behind it. All right, so you get to choose. Do you want to hand stitch your binding to the back? Do you want to machine stitch it? The choice is up to you. But either way, that's the last step in making your quilt.